Can you imagine how your life would be if you couldn't say what you wanted?
Naoki Higashida makes a map of his mind. It's kind of poetry.
How do I see the world? For me, the details jump straight out. Inside my head, there isn't really such a big difference between what I was told just now and what I heard a long time ago. My mind is forever swaying this way and that.
I've tried to stop her from being herself.
I think we can change the conversation around autism by being part of the conversation.
Right now, Joss is having a joy that I will never come close to.
To live my life as a human being, nothing is more important than being able to express myself.
Hi everyone, I'm John Offord. I'm a broadcaster based in the UK, and welcome to a very special episode of the Different Minds podcast series. Based on Naoki Higashida's groundbreaking memoir, in which a 13-year-old non-speaking autistic boy brilliantly describes his perception of the world, The Reason I Jump offers a rich and highly relatable first-hand portrait of what autism feels like. Following 5 young people from around the world and using excerpts from the book as a narrative thread, it describes how distressing or intensely beautiful the world can be for someone with autism spectrum disorder. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the director of The Reason I Jump, Jerry Rothwell, and the producer-contributor of the film, Jeremy Deere, Joss's father. Welcome to the Different Minds podcast series.
Hi, John.
Thank you. So I watched the film, and I think it's, it goes without saying that it's an outstanding documentary, which incidentally won the World Cinema Documentary Award at the Sundance Film Festival last year. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, 2020. Seems an age ago.
Yeah. So I really like how the film uses imaginative cinematography, I guess, in an attempt to let us see and hear a sensory world in a way that perhaps a non-verbal autistic person might see or hear it. So yeah, I guess my first question is, how did the idea for the film actually come about? And I guess this would be for Jerry to start with.
Yeah, well, actually, it should be for Jeremy, because
Right.
the idea for the film sort of came from Jeremy and Stevie, who are both producers and Joss's parents.
Yes,
Okay.
so we our son Joss is autistic, and when he was about 7 or 8, we came across the book The Reason I Jump, and it was we found it an absolutely fascinating, indeed, in fact, even revelatory read, really, because for the first time we were able to understand we were able to get a glimpse into the potential reasons behind some of the behaviors that our son was exhibiting, because I think when you have an autistic child as a parent, there are a lot of things that there is no manual. Your child is behaving differently, and when we read the book, we got an understanding of the reasons potentially behind that, and it was enormously reassuring. It was it helped us, I think, in being better parents, if I'm honest with you, because I think we were able to be more empathetic with Joss, and so having gleaned that from the book, we then got in touch with David Mitchell, who was the co-translator of the book, with his wife, and we got in touch with Naoki, and we optioned the book and then set about trying to find a way to turn this amazing book, which is, a real insight into, we think, into autism. But the challenge was then, how do you turn it into a film? Because the book is a series of questions and answers, which there's a sort of question, why do you flap your hands, or why do you like to jump, or whatever, and it's a page or two of text which gives you answers to those questions, which isn't necessarily the most sort of narrative driven subject for a film. That's when we sort of got together with Jerry and our co-producer Al Morrow, and sort of started to work the material along with David into something which we thought could make for an interesting and enlightening and film. And I think that the motive behind wanting to do it was really because we thought this was such an important book. We thought that what Nalki was saying was so important that it was key to get that message of understanding out there, to sort of bring to a wider audience the fact that there is reason, there is a reason to jumping. There is we need to be asking, we need to be condemning less and understanding more. And I think that's one of the things that Nalki really, that his book and his subsequent book, actually, which is also a tremendous read and highly recommended, are really good. Set out to do, and has really achieved that. It's interesting as well, just by the by, Nalki's book is part of a sort of canon of literature by autistic writers which write about autism from the inside. I think. And Jerry can speak to this, but I think our view is there has been a lot of autistic films about autism from the outside, which particularly, I think, from the parental point of view, and it's one of the things that we wanted. It's part of our film, but it is absolutely not the main part of it. So I think it's important that we were setting out from the beginning to try and give more of an insider's perspective.
Sure. And of course, the author wasn't actually in the film. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think originally we thought the film would be a film in part about Nalki, about this young boy who found his voice through writing and through spelling, and kind of became a writer. And so I went to Japan to meet Nalki and talk to him about that as an idea. And meeting Nalki is an incredible experience, just because I think of the process of communication that he uses, which is pointing to a board of to a letterboard. I mean, he also uses a computer independently as well. There's been some doubt as to whether Nalki wrote The Reason I Jump, whether it was sort of written by David Mitchell or by his mum. But I came away from that meeting absolutely certain of him as the author. He typed independently in a conversation to me, and his thoughts were just as kind of wise and poetic as the book is. So, but he did say, great, do the project, but I don't want to be in it, and I don't want it to be about me, which was a bit difficult. But actually, I think sent the film on a more interesting path, which is how do we use this kind of text, this sort of these words from this 12-year-old boy, as a way of looking at, exploring, understanding, and immersing us in the lives of 5 people around the world.
Yeah, and I think obviously it's important. The other thing I should have really said is that Naoki is largely non-speaking, and as is my son. I think they both have some language, but it's not the fluency with the language which most of us have, and that's another perspective that I think has been hitherto neglected in the canon of work about autism. It is this, and it's non-speaking. Autistic people constitute, I think, around sort of 30 to 35% of those who are generally recognised as autistic. So we felt there was very much a film that needed to be made, particularly about that particular cohort.
Yeah, absolutely. I wondered if I could just ask you as a director, Jerry. So, I guess there's an element of guesswork, isn't there, with this? Because ultimately, how do we know how other people think? And I just wondered if you could just talk to me about. You tried to take the audience into a slightly neurotypical way of looking at the world. And am I right in thinking that you set up an advisory board with autistic people in the UK? Just tell us a bit about that journey.
So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I don't know how you see the world, and you don't know how I see it, and it's quite hard to imagine yourself into someone else's head, I think, and quite a presumptive thing to do. I really resist the idea, I suppose, that the film is like a simulation of an experience, because I don't think that's possible. But I think what it can do maybe is just sit you to one side for a while of your kind of neurotypical assumptions and filters through which we generally interpret the world. The book above all sort of plunges you into this sensory experience. It talks about sounds and the ways things appear and patterns and how words kind of how sort of language is like kind of being in a stormy sea for Naoki. So it felt there were lots of clues in the book to thinking about how we shot and recorded the film. As you say, we worked with an advisory group of mostly verbal autistic people. And I guess the other thing we tried to do was to get as much of that imagery and sound out of people's actual situations, rather than try and impose a sort of set of special effects or kind of metaphorical images on it. We tried to, when we go and meet Amrit in her room in Delhi in 40-degree heat with these fans kind of spinning and kind of creating this breeze, we tried to just enter that space in a sensual way, try and sort of experience it not through our verbal assumptions or maybe the usual way you might cut a documentary, but try and put an audience there to feel it instead. So I think it's kind of immersive, but it's not a simulation.
Yeah. So what myths do you think the film demolishes then about autism?
I mean, I think it's interesting. Like in some ways, the film, there are some kind of tropes within the film. I think you have someone who's extremely good at art. You have people who are extremely brilliant in their own ways. But I think above all, it tries to get away from those sorts of ideas. Those ideas that people are either geniuses or fools. To try and put you in the kind of the everyday experience of people, not getting away from the trope of the exceptional human being, to get away from the trope of the person who has the secret meaning of life that we can all learn from. Those kinds of ideas, I guess, and tries to just explore a different way of seeing.
Yeah, and that's a really good point what you say, because often in the media they portray an autistic individual as someone with superhero skills, like a savant that has these amazing superhuman skills, or at the other end of the spectrum, someone that has high support needs. And it's either one extreme or the other. And of course, autism is part of the spectrum, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think it was really one of the sort of challenges of the film was how Naoki's words could be used as a sort of bedrock through the film without being seen as applicable to all autistic people, or even to the autistic people who we see in the film. That to try and create a space for them which helped you see from a different point of view, but didn't put that experience on everyone and to generalize about autism.
Yeah. Jeremy, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the variety within the spectrum is as infinite as the variety in the so-called normal world. And it's impossible to make generalizations about autistic people because they are all as individual as everybody else. I think one of the issues that there are these sort of fairly noxious myths about autism. They started in the 50s with the theory of refrigerator mothers, where autism was blamed. Doesn't need to be blamed on anyone, but it was blamed on coldness from mothers, which is a horrible thing. And that had a real currency for a while, in psychology circles. And then there have been various iterations of these wrong-headed ideas about autism, which have persisted until very recently. I mean, the lack of empathy being, I think, one of the most harmful, is that that autistic people are incapable of feeling emotion, and particularly incapable of feeling other people's emotion. And I think one of the things, I know from Joss, from my own son, that he's intensely aware of people's moods. He's intensely aware of how people react to him. that's something that Nalki writes very cogently about, is, you know, how distressed he is if he thinks he is a cause of a problem, or how much he takes on himself when he sees other people suffering. And you know, I really think that was a, you know, very much one of the things that we wanted to sort of tackle in this film, was to say that really isn't true. And it's that's part of sort of, I think, the wider conversation around autism, and hopefully the film's a little, you know, first step in that, which is about giving autistic people, well, not giving them, but allowing people to understand that there are just different ways of being. There's not lesser ways of being. I think, you know, the conversation is, autism was always looked at as a deficit. And I don't think that's necessarily the most helpful way, and indeed the most accurate way to look at autism at all. We need to be a great deal more open-minded than that.
So, as you say, Jeremy, your son Joss features in the film, and I read somewhere that you likened your son's thought process to an out of control slideshow. I wonder if you could just tell us about, were you able to learn things about your son that perhaps you didn't know before?
I think, well, I'm always learning with Joss. It's a continual, you know, because his language is very limited. He talks. I mean, in fact, very much. This is something that I learned. You know, I understood from the book. Joss likes is echolaic, which means that, you know, he likes to repeat certain phrases, but that's his way of interacting. So what he says something, then we have to make a certain response to him, the right response, and then he'll give us a response, and it is absolutely like a game of tennis or a game of catch, you know. So he desperately wants that social interchange, again demolishing that theory that they would rather be alone. I think that's Nalki writes in the book, you know, how many times have I heard that, you know, it's so wrong. And that's absolutely a facet of Joss as well. He wants that interchange. The interchange happens in a different way. The language it's about passing things back and forward, and he gets real joy and pleasure from that. So I am always learning, you know, things from Joss. And I think the thing with the thing you allude to, the slideshow, is really about memory for him, because his memories are very much part of his present. So he will often, and he does this in the film, you know, he will mention something that happened 7 years ago at a particular place on a particular moment, and that seared itself into his memory. It will pop out, and he will say, you know, Rupert's dog is in the cinema. Well, we did have my friend called Rupert who put a dog in a cinema in a cinema once, because and that's, you know, that'll just pop out, and then something else will pop out from, you know, 10 years ago. I mean, his memory goes back to when he was 2 years old. He's got the most extraordinary memory, but it doesn't necessarily come out in a kind of narrative order. It seems to come out spontaneously, which is, you know, I mean, it must be an extraordinarily confusing experience, I think, for him. But potentially also, he does take pleasure from it. So, you know,
really interesting.
It's a conundrum. It's something that we are continually learning about and trying to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Jerry, so you also obviously featured different characters all over the globe, in Sierra Leone, obviously India, and also in Arlington in Virginia, where you focus on childhood best friends Ben and Emma. I wondered if you can tell us a bit more about those characters. And I know they attended a progressive homeschooling facilitation where they were using is it called the message boards? Is that what you call it?
Letterboard.
The letterboards. And I know that I've read somewhere that, you know, that source of communication method, the rapid prompting method, essentially remains controversial in some autism research circles, because I guess it emphasizes neurotypical people's misguided tendency to associate non-speaking with lack of comprehension, and therefore demonstrates the benefit of the method in Ben and Emma's case. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that controversy stems from the technique called facilitated communication, which became very popular in the 1990s, where parts of the body were supported in order to point at a letterboard. And when that was subjected to sort of a more kind of rigorous scrutiny, a lot of those messages seem to be coming more from the facilitator than from the person themselves.
Yeah.
I think what happened as a consequence of that was that, you know, the idea that people who were non-speaking had language also got kind of thrown out as an idea. And that's clearly untrue. There are lots and lots of instances, quite even apart from letterboard communications, where language is, you know, people are clearly processing, understanding, and communicating with language, but then perhaps not in a conventional way.
Sure.
Rapid prompting method is a different technique, and actually Ben and Emma learnt with a woman at a centre called Spelling to Communicate, which uses a different method again. Sort of starting from who's a speech therapist who started getting into using letterboards. I mean, my experience of being with people communicating with letterboards was that it kind of opened up all kinds of possibilities. I mean, for Ben and Emma, whose schooling, I think they say in the film, you know, Ben says that he felt that his schooling deprived him of his civil rights because it kind of put him in a corner away from other kids, you know, with the kind of with the baby education stuff rather than the things that he was interested in. And it, you know, I think ultimately it's enabled them, as you see in the film, to kind of live independently as well. So it's like an incredibly communication. I think Naoki says it in the book. You know, if I couldn't communicate, I would feel like it wasn't worth existing, or something. I think he says something like that. And I think it's an incredibly important tool, and certainly, you know, facilitated communication was problematic. You know, I think that there may be a stage in which people learn to use letterboards where they need that kind of support, but all of the people in the film and all of the people I've seen using it at kind of a level where they're writing books are generally using it very independently. You know, you see Emma in the film using an iPad and actually vocalizing the words as she does it. So I think you know, I hope that technique spreads more widely, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. The use of keyboards, you know, just conventional keyboards. Several autistic writers have progressed on from using letterboards to using conventional keyboard, so and write beautifully. So the ability can be often is there. I think there's another point which is about language, which is, you know, because people often don't speak, the regrettable tendency is to think that they don't think. And there is that's just should be a total non sequitur. I mean, for instance, again, my son Joss, he's received language. He understands everything that you say to him. He knows. You know, one of the worst things that, you know, I think we did when we were young parents is to sometimes think, well, he can't talk, so he's not hearing. And you know, we were disabused of that, you know, by fairly quickly by just, you know, watching Joss, but also I think, you know, Naoki's writings confirmed it. You know, the ability to understand language is very, very often entirely unimpaired. And then it's not a great leap to say, well, you know, these, you know, autistic people, non-speaking autistic people can obviously understand the language. So there's not a big jump to think that they can generate language. It just has to be in a way that doesn't involve talking. And letterboards is one way of doing that, you know, but there are others too.
And of course, there's the really beautiful moment in the film when Ben says through the letterboard, I think we can change the conversation around autism by being part of the conversation. I mean, that's a real beautiful moment.
And I think I think from him for how long he's been an observer, not being part of conversations that he wants to be part of as well. You know, it's kind of carried in that phrase, isn't it?
Yeah. Can you tell us about Justina in Sierra Leone? So obviously, Justina and her parents confront superstition, demonization, and essentially a lack of understanding, I guess, as they looking to open the country's first special needs school. I mean, how did you find them first and foremost, and what an amazing group of characters they are?
I mean, I guess each sort of person in the film sort of plays a kind of role that takes the audience on this kind of journey. And Justina is where we end up, and I think we end up there because we wanted to explore the society's role in this, not just being about the individual or their creativity or their language or their sensory experience, but what role does this, what role does a society have in discrimination or in facilitating and supporting the lives of autistic people. And I've been shooting another film in Sierra Leone, but I came across Mary's work, which Mary's the mother of Justina, a young autistic woman. She's, I think, 19. Justina is. And Mary had started doing this work. Well, she became aware of how few other autistic people there were sort of in public life in Sierra Leone, and kind of came across that around the role of demons in disability, but particularly in autism, such that autistic children were being abandoned, particularly in the rural areas, and started doing this work with parents, particularly in rural areas. And we see some of that work, a moment of that work in the film, and ultimately that leads to her creating the first school for autistic people in Sierra Leone, and actually she's now set up a number of centres around the country. So it's just incredibly sort of dedicated. She's one of those people who is like an incredibly dedicated sort of powerhouse to change things.
Absolutely. What was the biggest challenge making the film?
I mean, from a filmmaking point of view, it was how to sort of turn all those disparate experiences into some kind of coherent journey for an audience, I would say. I guess there are challenges in ensuring that the film sort of truly represents people. I think that's a big challenge, especially as a kind of, as relatively neurotypical filmmakers. How do we speak about this experience in a way where the speech kind of starts from those who are experiencing it, as it does from people in the film, and trying to involve autistic people in the production right the way through was key to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jerry, I think I read that you said that you were wary of actually saying the film is about autism.
Yeah, I mean, it's autism's a problematic category, I think, and I think the challenge of neurodiversity as an idea, I think, is in a way such an exciting idea, because it kind of honours the way that we all see the world in subtly different ways, and we sort of cluster around different commonalities around that, I suppose. And so in a way, I'd rather people came into it and didn't feel like, oh, I'm going to see the autism film, but I'm going to go and see a film about, Justina and Ben and Emma and Amrit and Joss, and let's just encounter them in this 90 minutes. And if that makes us conclude some things about other people we think are like them, then that's okay.
Yeah, and I know you've already really answered this question, but do you think the film speaks for all autistic people?
Absolutely not. No, I think there's a line in the film that Naoki uses about his own writing that says, I don't assume that any of my words apply to all autistic people. I mean, having said that, there are lots of commonalities amongst autistic people, and that autistic identity is becoming incredibly powerful at bringing about change in the way the neurotypical world sees autism. So it's a kind of, there's a sort of balance there between asserting the individuality of everyone and the things that they have in common.
Yeah. And I just wondered, I know the film essentially focuses on non-verbal autistic individuals, but I just wondered, would it have been better to have also featured autistic individuals with low support needs on the film too, so you can see the breadth of the autism spectrum?
I sort of feel that Naoki's book speaks specifically to the non-verbal experience, and that was our starting point. And again, it wasn't a film about autism, maybe. So it was kind of like, what can we learn from this? The words of this boy in a Tokyo suburb who's speaking about a very specific experience, but one which is shared by other people around the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you hope the film will achieve?
I hope it will, as I say, I hope it'll start a conversation, basically. I hope I hope it'll speed up a conversation, which actually I think is happening already. In the last 12 years, since I've been sort of, I suppose, aware of, the way that we as a society view autism. I think there's been quite considerable progress. I think, particularly as Jerry just said, the move towards a neurodiverse outlook, and the sort of the embracing of different ways of seeing the world is something which I think has, is enormously heartening. Actually, I think we are making progress. I hope the film can aid that conversation. I hope that film will make us make. This is the irony is that, going back on the point I said earlier about empathy, neurotypicals are the least empathetic people towards autistic people. We need to learn more empathy towards them, rather than the other way around. We need to make space to understand, and to support when necessary. Everybody, particularly autistic people, non-speaking autistic people, who clearly, because they don't have the faculty of easy communication, may need that extra support. I think there are huge social issues. I think in most countries about the amount of resources that are allocated towards autistic people and so on, and that's a wider political conversation too. But I hope the film will just sort of aid in that general debate.
Brilliant, thank you. So I guess the final question is, when is the film coming out here in the UK, and where can we find out more?
So it releases on June the 18th in Picture House cinemas, but it'll also go wider than the Picture House chain. We're experimenting with also doing some relaxed screenings as part of that, which is trying to create a less intense cinema setup for those that prefer that or find some aspects of cinema alienating, but as well as conventional screenings. So seek out which you prefer, I guess.
And if any of our international viewers, listeners are watching, where might they be able to access the film as well?
So it's on release in cinemas around the world. I mean, the American release happened in January, and it's now on DVD there, and available digitally soon. And then different countries, if you go to the Reason I Jump website, reasonijumpfilm.com, thereasonijumpfilm.com, you'll see announcements of where it's releasing in different countries. So I think France and Australia are towards the end of this year. Belgium and some other European countries are coming up. So
great, thank you. And I'm going to ask you both one final question, and this is a question that I ask all my guests on my podcast series. I'll start with you, Jerry. If you had the chance to offer your younger self some advice, what would that be?
Oh, I don't know. I think sort of relentlessly kind of what's the word? Plow your own furrow. Kind of try and make a virtue of whatever your peculiarities are, and don't try and fit in too much.
Absolutely. And sorry to put you on the spot there first. Over to you, Jeremy.
Don't take yourself so seriously, probably.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And nothing is as dramatic as you might first think it is.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and sharing your work with all of us. It's been a real pleasure to listen and learn from you both, and I really hope that The Reason I Jump plays a big part in the next step, essentially, of how society at large sees autism and celebrates difference, and it's all about neurodiversity, which is obviously a good thing. That's all for now. Thanks for listening and watching even to this episode of the Different Minds podcast series. Don't forget you can follow us and share your thoughts with us on Twitter. It's at the @diff_minds_pod. Our podcast is available on all major platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you like what you're hearing on the Different Minds podcast, please share this episode and review our show on Apple Podcasts. Thank you very much.